What if the Babylonian captivity had never taken place? Imagine a timeline where the armies of King Nebuchadnezzar never breached the walls of Jerusalem. The sacred First Temple, the beating heart of ancient Judaism, still stands, its incense rising to the heavens, its rituals uninterrupted, its priests carrying out age-old traditions in a city untouched by exile. There is no chain of Jewish elders marched into the alien streets of Babylon. No traumatic dislocation. No desperate need to reinterpret faith in a foreign land. The scrolls that would eventually shape the Hebrew Bible remain oral traditions, passed from generation to generation within the safe bounds of a sovereign Judah. Now ask yourself, without that rupture, without the scattering of prophets and scribes across Mesopotamian soil, would Judaism have ever become the adaptable, portable, and deeply philosophical religion it is today? Or would it have remained a regional tribal belief? Ritualistic, temple-bound, and deeply tied to one patch of land. But the ripples of this alternate reality go far beyond the fate of Judaism alone. What happens to Christianity in a world without a Jewish diaspora? Does a young preacher named Jesus still spark a spiritual revolution if there's no widespread Jewish network for his apostles to reach? Would Islam, centuries later, still draw upon Jewish theology if Jewish communities had never spread throughout the ancient world? In this thought experiment, we peel back the layers of history and enter a timeline that never was, a world not shaped by exile, but by continuity. A world where the chains never clinked in Babylon, and where the echoes of that silence may have changed the religious foundations of our modern civilization. Welcome to a journey through the unknown corridors of history, a story reimagined through the lens of what could have been. In the 6th century BCE, a seismic event shattered the ancient world. The mighty Babylonian Empire, led by the ruthless King Nebuchadnezzar II, swept through the kingdom of Judah, toppling its defenses, burning its cities, and ultimately laying waste to its most sacred site, Solomon's Temple. This wasn't just the fall of a nation, it was the obliteration of a worldview. For the people of Judah, the destruction of the temple wasn't merely the loss of a building, it was the collapse of a cosmic center, the very place where heaven and earth were believed to meet. But the devastation didn't stop at the rubble. Babylon exiled the Judean elite, the priests, the prophets, the scholars, the artisans, ripping the intellectual and spiritual backbone out of the kingdom. These exiles weren't just prisoners of war. They were carriers of a centuries-old tradition now torn from its land, its rituals rendered impossible, its gods seemingly silenced. And yet, this exile, this violent uprooting, would prove to be far more than a geopolitical conquest. It became a crucible. A refining fire that tested the very soul of Judaism. Without the temple, without kingship, without sovereignty, the Jewish people were forced to ask, who are we without the land? What is God without the altar? How do we preserve identity when everything physical has been stripped away? In Babylon, a spiritual transformation began. Judaism shifted from being a religion of place to a religion of people. The seeds of a more portable, text-based faith took root. It was here that Torah study gained new centrality, where synagogues began to replace the temple as gathering points, and where prophets like Ezekiel and Jeremiah reimagined covenant and exile in radically new ways. The Babylonian captivity was not just a footnote in ancient politics. It was the moment Judaism began to evolve into something that could survive without borders, without kings, and without stone walls. It was the beginning of Judaism as we know it today. In the heart of exile, far from Jerusalem's sacred hills, a quiet revolution unfolded, one not of swords or empires, but of spirit and identity. Cut off from the temple, the ancient rituals that had once defined Jewish life could no longer be performed. The daily rhythms of sacrifice, the annual festivals centered around the holy city, gone. But instead of fading into obscurity, Judaism adapted. It was in this forced stillness, under the shadow of Babylon's ziggurats, that Jewish identity began to redefine itself, not by place, but by memory, belief, and sacred text. With no physical altar to offer sacrifices upon, worship took on a new form. It became internal, reflective, and deeply personal. Prayer and study began to replace sacrifice. Homes became miniature sanctuaries. The community gathered in exile began to elevate the word over the sword, law over land, and covenant over kingdom. In the absence of political sovereignty, a remarkable thing happened. The oral traditions that had guided generations were written down. Stories that had once been shared around fires or recited in temple courts were now being compiled, organized, and debated. The Torah began to take shape, not just as a religious document, but as a constitution for a people in exile. Prophetic writings, historical records, wisdom literature, all were woven together into a canon that would sustain the Jewish people not just in Babylon, but across millennia. This transformation birthed something truly radical, a structured, portable monotheism. No longer anchored to a single geographic location, the Jewish faith became something that could travel in scrolls and minds. It could flourish in foreign lands, survive the fall of empires, and adapt to the ever-shifting tides of history. The exile may have been meant as punishment, but in its fires, a new kind of faith was forged. One that would not only endure, but would eventually inspire two of the world's other great monotheistic religions. But now, let's step away from what did happen, and imagine what might have been. What if the great Babylonian conquest had stopped short of total devastation? What if, instead of tearing down walls and burning temples, Nebuchadnezzar had chosen a different strategy, conquest without destruction? Suppose the armies marched into Jerusalem, claimed tribute, and asserted dominance, but left the people in place. The temple still stood, its golden menorah flickering as priests carried on their sacred duties. The streets of Jerusalem still echoed with the sounds of festivals, debates, and sacrifices. The elite, the thinkers, the prophets, the scribes, remained rooted in their homeland, their traditions undisturbed by exile. In this alternate history, the trauma that reshaped Jewish theology never arrives. The questions of identity in a foreign land never need to be asked. There is no Babylon to force introspection, no distance to demand preservation through text. Without exile, there is no need to reinvent Judaism as a portable faith, no urgency to canonize scripture, no spark for the rise of synagogues, or the deep textual tradition that would come to define rabbinic Judaism. This is the fork in the road we now choose to walk. A different path, unmarked by chains and exile, but just as rich in possibility. What kind of Judaism would have emerged from continuity rather than catastrophe? And perhaps more provocatively, what would the absence of that transformation mean for the religions that followed? Let's step into this imagined world. A world where Babylon took the land, but left the soul untouched. A world of tradition uninterrupted. A world of belief that never had to migrate to survive. Had the Babylonian exile never happened, the spiritual trajectory of Judaism might have looked radically different. Without the disruption, without the forced disconnection from homeland and temple, Judaism may have remained deeply localized, bound to the soil of ancient Judah and inseparable from the rituals performed within the sacred walls of the temple. Religious life would have continued to revolve around the rhythms of sacrifice, pilgrimage, and priestly decree. The temple would remain the epicenter, not just physically, but spiritually and politically. Its priests, the Kohanim, might have held unchallenged religious authority, controlling not only worship, but the interpretation of divine will. In such a scenario, the prophetic voices that rose so powerfully in exile, voices that questioned power, demanded justice, and spoke of a God beyond borders, may never have found the same footing. And without the existential threat posed by exile, would there have been the urgency, the necessity, to preserve oral traditions in written form? Probably not. The Torah as we know it, written, structured, canonized, might never have existed in the same way. Instead, religious practice could have remained oral, ceremonial, and centralized around the temple apparatus. Rather than a text-based faith capable of traveling across empires and oceans, Judaism could have resembled the temple-centric religions of antiquity, like the cults of ancient Egypt, tied to their pyramids and priests, or Rome's state rituals performed for civic stability. These systems were rich and meaningful, but not portable. When their temples fell, their gods often faded. A Judaism unshaken by exile might have become a powerful regional religion, but one trapped in its geography. Its message could have remained bounded by borders, its impact restrained by ritual, its evolution stalled by stability. In short, without the crucible of exile, Judaism might never have become a global religion. It could have remained a temple-state faith, vivid, sacred, but ultimately static. And the ripple effect of that is staggering. Here's where things start to take a truly fascinating turn. Because the Babylonian exile didn't just reshape Judaism, it quietly laid the foundation for something far larger. Out of the trauma of exile came dispersion, and out of that dispersion came the Jewish diaspora, vibrant, interconnected communities stretching from Babylon to Alexandria, from Rome to Asia Minor. And it was in this web of exiled synagogues that something unexpected began to grow. Fast forward several centuries, and you find a man named Paul, formerly Saul of Tarsus, walking dusty Roman roads, letters in hand, fire in his heart. Where did he go first? Not to pagan temples. Not to imperial forums. But to synagogues. Jewish synagogues. Scattered across the Mediterranean world, these diaspora communities were Paul's first listeners. They were familiar with scripture. They debated ideas. They were fluent in both local cultures and the Jewish tradition. And through these communities, Paul introduced a revolutionary message, a Messiah not just for Jews, but for all people. Now let's rewind and remove the exile from the equation. No exile, no diaspora. No diaspora, no synagogues scattered across the Greco-Roman world. No synagogues, no ready-made audiences for Paul. And without that infrastructure of Jewish thought and presence abroad, Paul's message would have lacked the cultural scaffolding it needed to spread. There would have been no Jewish-Greek communities to act as bridges between Hebrew scripture and Gentile curiosity. In this alternate world, Jesus himself might still have walked the hills of Galilee. He might have preached to fishermen, healed the sick, and clashed with authorities. But his words might never have reached the ears of the empire. Without the diaspora, Jesus could have remained a regional mystic, a local prophet, honored perhaps, but unknown outside a sliver of Judea. And so we ask, without the exile, the scattering, the network that Paul so deftly used, would Christianity ever have taken root? Would there even have been a Christdom? The thread is fragile. And in this alternate history, it might have snapped before it ever began. Centuries later, the rise of Islam would find its roots deeply entwined with both Judaism and Christianity, drawing from the wellsprings of earlier monotheistic traditions. The stories of Moses, Abraham, and the other prophets, sacred figures for all three faiths, were not just preserved, they were transmitted, reshaped, and reinterpreted through the prism of Jewish texts and the teachings that had spread throughout the Mediterranean. But where did this cross-pollination occur? It happened in part because of the Jewish diaspora, the scattered communities whose traditions and teachings reverberated across vast regions. In an alternate timeline, where the Babylonian exile never happened, there would be no widespread Jewish diaspora to carry the narrative across borders. Without those Jewish communities in Alexandria, Rome, and beyond, the theological landscapes of the ancient world would look very different. Judaism, unshaken by exile, might have remained tightly contained within its ancient borders, without the cultural exchange that allowed for the intertwining of Jewish beliefs with Greco-Roman and Arabian traditions. Consider the impact on Islam. particularly on the formation of the Quran and the prophethood of Muhammad. If Judaism had never expanded beyond Judah, the religious terrain in Mecca, the birthplace of Islam, would be radically different. Muhammad might not have encountered the same theological influence that he did in reality. The shared stories of the Hebrew Bible, the concept of a singular, all-powerful God, and the foundational monotheistic narratives that were so crucial in shaping Islam. Without the Jewish diaspora spreading teachings into Arabia, would the figure of Abraham, revered by all three faiths, even have been as central to the Quranic narrative? Would the Quran have included the rich traditions of Jewish prophets and the stories of the Israelites? Or would Islam have developed in isolation, perhaps with a very different understanding of monotheism? The theological foundation of Islam itself might have been altered without the influence of Jewish and Christian thought. The shared ideas of prophecy, divine law, and the covenantal relationship with God might not have been as readily available. Would Islam, as we know it today, have emerged in the same form, unified in belief and practice? If it had not been shaped by the religious currents flowing through the ancient world, currents in part made possible by the Jewish diaspora. It's a question that forces us to confront the delicate threads of history. Without that chain of transmission, would Islam have even resembled the faith we know today? Would the monotheistic faith of Islam have been as widespread, as connected to both Judaism and Christianity? Or would it have remained more isolated in its inception? If the Babylonian exile had never taken place, the kingdom of Judah could have endured as a far stronger and potentially longer-lasting state. With the heart of Judaism remaining firmly planted in the land, the influence of Jerusalem, its temple, and its kings would have grown without interruption. The absence of exile would have allowed Judah to build a more solid foundation for its identity and culture, unfettered by the trauma of conquest and displacement. But how far could this kingdom have gone? Could Judah have evolved into a regional superpower capable of challenging the great empires of the ancient world, Persia, Egypt, or even Rome? Perhaps it's not so far-fetched to imagine a powerful and flourishing Israelite kingdom that was not only militarily robust, but economically influential. With Judah's strategic location at the crossroads of Africa, Asia, and Europe, it would have been positioned as a key player in regional trade networks, linking the civilizations of the Mediterranean to those of Mesopotamia and beyond. Trade, rather than the spread of religious texts, might have been the tool that fueled Judah's rise. Its merchants, philosophers, and artisans could have carried the kingdom's cultural influence, making it a center of commerce and intellectual exchange. In this reimagined world, the Middle East's religious and political landscape would have been radically different. The political and cultural dynamics between Israel, its neighbors, and the broader region could have played out in entirely different ways. The rise of Israel as a strong, unified nation might have altered the course of history for the Persian and Roman empires, perhaps sparking rivalries or alliances that shifted the tides of power in ways we can only speculate about today. The great empires of antiquity may have found themselves contending with an Israel that was not just a small vassal state, but an established and influential power in its own right. Now, think about how the world's religions would have evolved without the scattering of the Jewish people. Without the exile, the spread of Judaism outside of its land may have been much slower or more limited. The intertwining of Jewish beliefs with those of neighboring cultures, and the later formation of Christianity, would have been far less likely. Christianity, which arose in the wake of the destruction of the Temple and the Jewish diaspora, might never have emerged in the same form, or perhaps not at all. Without Christianity's spread, the religious identity of the West might have been vastly different, and the concept of Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, might never have taken root as we know it today. The Christian Crusades, born out of the desire to reclaim Jerusalem, might never have happened, and the complex and often violent relationship between Jews, Christians, and Muslims throughout history might not have existed at all. And then there's the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, a deeply entrenched issue of our time. Without the long history of exile, return, and struggle over land, would there even be such a conflict in the first place? Would the modern concept of Zionism, and the desire to return to the land of Israel, have taken the same form, or would the notion of a Jewish homeland have been less urgent, less political? Just imagine a Middle East where the Abrahamic faiths didn't overlap in such complex and often contentious ways. A world where Judah's legacy remained tied to the land, not spread across the globe through conquest, diaspora, and religion. It's a tantalizing thought experiment, one that reminds us of just how fragile and unpredictable the course of history can be. If the Babylonian exile had never happened, what kind of world would we be living in today? So, what do you think? Would a world without the Babylonian exile be more unified, less divided, or perhaps less spiritually rich? The echoes of that pivotal moment in history still resonate in the structure of modern religious and cultural identities. Without the exile, would Judaism have remained more localized, or could it have developed into a global force through different means? Could the absence of such a transformative event have shaped the religions we know today in ways we can't even begin to imagine? Would Christianity and Islam have emerged the way we know them, or would they have taken entirely different paths? This alternate history raises so many possibilities. Some might argue that without the trauma of exile, Judaism would have remained deeply entrenched in its local, national context, creating a world less interconnected by monotheistic faiths. Others might say that the absence of exile could have meant no Christianity, no Islam, and a world where religious division took a different shape altogether. It's a complex web of outcomes, with each one leading to a new reality. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this alternate timeline. Could the world have been less divided without the Babylonian exile? Or would we have lost something essential in terms of spiritual growth and religious exchange? Drop your ideas and theories in the comments below. Maybe your unique perspective will spark the next great debate about the course of history. And if you love diving into what if history with a twist, don't forget to give us a like. Share this video with a fellow time traveler who loves exploring alternate realities. After all, the world of speculative history is vast, and there's always room for new ideas. History, as we know it, is written in stone, solid, unchanging. But imagination allows us to rewrite the past, not to alter the events, but to understand them more profoundly. It's through the lens of what if that we come to grasp the deeper meanings and ripple effects of historical moments. The Babylonian captivity may have been a tragedy, a defining moment that shattered a nation and scattered its people. But in that very tragedy, something profound was set into motion. In its wake, the seeds of global religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, were planted, reaching far beyond the land of Judah. No exile. Perhaps there would have been no Bible, no synagogue, no Sunday sermons, and no Ramadan prayers. Without the exile, could the very religions that have shaped the world be what they are today? It's fascinating to think about the world that rose from the ashes of Jerusalem. A new world, one that echoed with both loss and renewal, one where the religious and cultural landscape shifted forever. What we know today as global religions may have remained local, tribal, or perhaps even never existed. The Babylonian captivity is more than just a historical event, it's a moment in time that shaped the very course of history, pushing us to ask, what might have been if that pivotal moment never happened? If you've enjoyed this journey through alternate history, be sure to subscribe to Timelines Rewritten. We dive into speculative history, exploring where the past bends and the future begins. Join us as we continue to explore the world that could have been, and uncover the untold stories of how history might have unfolded.